so much on Page I'm an Alcoholic. And yeah, where we're going to be diving in is actually on page 567. You see, last week we were on page 47 and we were talking about step 2, part 1. And then we got an asterisk. And some of you guys know I like to joke about, I don't do what asterisks tell me to do. I don't listen to you. But it said please. So I joke, they said, please, I'll pop on over. So where we're picking up, page 567, it's the Spiritual Experience Appendix. So we're going to go into a little bit of detail about what a spiritual experience is. And I talk about this, that I find that we have so many sneaky descriptions of a spiritual experience or a spiritual awakening throughout the book that are beautiful and eloquent and just like perfect descriptions, but it took me a while to be able to see them. And so the Spiritual Experience Appendix was meant to sort of help us be like, okay, what are we talking about? And why we would see this, the last place we look for it is at this point in We Agnostics is about step 2. And to very quickly summarize step 2 as we dive into the Spiritual Experience Appendix on page 567, I'm giving y'all plenty of time to find it. So don't come at me if you're like, I haven't found it yet. You got plenty of time. But to summarize what step 2 is, step 2 is simply about believing a spiritual experience is possible. That's it. That's it. I don't have to like God. I don't have to like the word God. I don't have to have a spiritual awakening on step 2. I don't have to walk hand in hand on the beach with a higher power, which is good news because I live in Alberta and it's landlocked. There aren't any beaches, and the other one about the lack of walking over here. But all of those, thank goodness. So I just need to believe that a spiritual experience is possible. So let's kick it off. Spiritual experience. The terms spiritual experience and spiritual awakening are used many times in this book. Now, I'll tell you some different perspectives. There are people who believe strongly that there is a difference between a spiritual experience and a spiritual awakening. And those people believe that a spiritual experience is something that happens quite suddenly. Like I experience it. An awakening is an experience that happens a little bit more gradually. And I'll tell you what I believe. I believe I don't care. I believe it doesn't matter. That's what I believe. So feel free to write inventory on me. And the reason is because sometimes I get lost in the weeds or lost in the woods trying to define something that I don't necessarily need to define. And yes, thank you, Rob. He's got all the fun facts in the chat. Stay tuned. Because I'll get so caught up, and I know you guys would never do this, but I'm somebody that I'll get caught up in pedantry, which is to be pedantic. I'll get caught up in knowing the right thing. And actually, I don't know if you're aware, a spiritual awakening happens more gradually. And it's like, but that doesn't actually matter. What actually matters is what I experience. That's what matters. And here's the thing. As an alcoholic, I couldn't stay well on one drink. Anyone here have one drink and think, boy, that was sufficient. I'm all done. No, I couldn't stay well on one drink. I can't stay well on one experience or one awakening. I need to continue to have and to seek. So for me, they are simply synonyms. Other synonyms that we will see throughout the book, and we have seen throughout the book, include in the chapter, The Doctor's Opinion, psychic change. The word psychic means of mind and of soul. So spiritual awakening is a change of the mind, but also a change of the soul. And we see the word change. We see a whole bunch of different descriptions and words used. But so the terms spiritual experience and spiritual awakening are used many times in this book, which, upon careful reading, shows that the personality change sufficient to bring about recovery from alcoholism has manifested itself among us in many different forms. So another synonym for a spiritual awakening is also this change of personality, a transformation. And So what it's saying, it's like, hey, let me summarize this paragraph. It's saying, hey, we've used spiritual awakening and spiritual experience a whole lot in this book. And really what we're talking about is that change that allows alcoholics to stay sober. And that experience has shown up in those of us who have recovered in many different ways, in many different forms. The awakenings themselves can be quite unique, but we'll see that there are similarities among them. And again, I couldn't stay well on one spiritual awakening. I needed to continue to have and to seek. So it goes on to say, yet it is true that our first printing gave many readers the impression that these personality changes or religious experiences, again, another synonym for a spiritual awakening, must be in the nature of sudden and spectacular upheavals. And so, as Rob put in the chat, the Spiritual Experience Appendix was not listed or included in the first edition. It was added in it was included in the second printing of the first edition. Sorry, it was included March 1941. And it probably because a lot of us would read some of the spiritual experiences that are described, and I know you guys don't do this. But somebody like me, I will glom on to this idea. I'll just grab a hold of it and I'd be like, oh, I didn't have one like Bill. I can't recover. You know what I mean? Not you guys. You guys are super open-minded and you have, but me, I get a little black and white with my thinking. It gets a little rigid up in here and I'll grab a hold of that old idea and I'll run it to the ground. And so I want to talk a little bit about the spiritual awakenings and the spiritual experiences that were described in the book. Now, the first one that many of us grab a hold of is Bill Wilson's White Light Spiritual Experience. And we're gonna talk about that here in a little bit. But we also saw a description in the doctor's opinion for Fitz Mayo and Hank Parkhurst. And the description of Hank Parkhurst's spiritual awakening was that the person who stood before him a year after he first met him was somebody that was unrecognizable to him. He knew that the guy was Hank, and he could like, hey, you got Hank's nose, you got Hank's ears, I know you're Hank, but who you are standing before me is somebody profoundly different. And it spoke about when the description of Fitz Mayo and his spiritual experience. We'll talk a little bit more about that. His spiritual experience is described in the doctor's opinion was that he became someone, the description is a fine specimen of manhood as one could wish to meet. But the best representation of humanity, that Fitz Mayo was clearly just the best version of himself. And what came along with that was the description of that they stayed sober, this transformation from the inside out. And those aren't the very sudden, spectacular descriptions that we see. But I point that out to know that we have some more subtler descriptions. But what it's saying is that these personality, or religious experience must be in the nature of sudden and spectacular upheavals. Happily for everyone, this conclusion is erroneous. Erroneous is another way to say false or incorrect. So what it's saying is you don't necessarily have to have that white light spiritual experience in order to recover. It goes on to say, in the first few chapters, a number of sudden revolutionary changes are described. So let's talk a bit about Bill Wilson. Bill Wilson, he had what is known as a white light spiritual experience. And his experience, he in his story, he tells about how he took the actions of the 12 steps. And then he saw this flash of white, this light that came over him. And he sees himself on top of a mountain. And in the description, he feels this amazing lifted up, a sense of victory, a calm, a peace, a serenity as he had never known. And a lot of times we will read that and we think, boy, Bill's lost his mind. To be fair, Bill thought he lost his mind. But what I want you to know about Bill Wilson's spiritual experience is there is a book that is that we're going to talk about in much more detail as we go through this appendix. And it is a book written by the psychologist William Jame. And it is called Varieties of Religious Experiences. And it was originally a series of lectures that were given in Edinburgh University. And William James was a scientist, and he wanted to study these spiritual experiences, these religious conversions, these, sudden changes in the lives of people. And it was a series of lectures that were given. And it's in chapter 10, the lecture on conversion. It describes white light spiritual experiences, and how he refers to them is luminous phenomena. And you can write that down if you want, you don't have to. But what I want to point out is that luminous phenomena is a description of things that were happening, what that means is that it's not that crazy. Now, bear with me with this, because if you're a little Noctivagant, which is of the night, and when I say Noctivagant, I mean spiritually Noctivagant. So I'm showing up in my spiritual emo phase. Not you guys wouldn't do that. But I'm spiritually I'm too cool for school, and I don't care what you got. You know what I mean? And when you're in that spiritual darkness, and there's that person who shows up and they are light. That light is on in their eyes. You know what I mean? They come into the room and they change the whole vibe of the meeting. That's nice of you to say. Those sorts of people. It's actually Babe. That's who he's pointing to. He's talking to Babe. Babe's one of those people. Babe shows up. He brings that light. Now, if I'm in that spiritual darkness, you guys know what it's like when you've been a teenager and you're in the dark in your room and you're brooding, and your mom comes in and turns on the light. This isn't good for your eyes. And it's it's so bright that it almost hurts. And that was also my experience when I was early and new and not recovered. And I would go to meetings and I would see the light on in people. I would see the joy and the brightness. And it was almost like, I don't like it, because I was in so much darkness. And so it's an important reminder that if I'm feeling that way, that of course that's natural, but it might be because I am in that spiritual darkness. And why I reference Bill Wilson's spiritual experience is because I hear again and again and again in my local meetings, well, you don't want to expect to have a spiritual experience like Bill, turn into Eeyore. I've lost my tail. The best that I can hope for is, and we're going to talk about it, the educational variety. And maybe just one day at a time, my life won't suck. Like that. And I hear that again and again and again. And what I want to say is nonsense. Nonsense. The spiritual experience that I have is without question none of my business. My business is to take the course of action. These 12 steps is a way of life, like my life depends on it, because it does. The results are not in my hands, but I'll tell you what my experience is. I have had many deep and powerful spiritual experiences. Many. Not just one, many, because I have continued to grow and to seek and to go after this thing like my life depends on it. I couldn't stay well on one drink. I can't stay well on one experience. And I work with people who have deep and powerful spiritual experiences. What I've found that happens is we take a long time to go through the work. And if we take a long time to go through the work, I'm not going to get that same experience that if I go through this work quickly and thoroughly that I'm going to get. You guys know what I'm saying? And I realized I was listening to Variety of Religious Experience again, because I found a new recording that's way better. And by better, I mean the gentleman who's doing the audiobook for it isn't reading like this. So that I'll let you know that helps when you're listening to a book that's notoriously quite dry. So I was listening to it again, and it reminded me of what I speak about quite a lot, which is the experience of the first drink. That experience, you guys know what I'm talking about. The experience of the first drink, which is, you know what I'm talking about? Yeah. You see, when I'm after a drink, I'm after that experience. But guess what happens if I were to drink? And I'm going to describe something that is going to annoy every single person in this meeting, so I'm going to apologize ahead of time. Let me describe this form of drinking. You get out a glass. I know I've lost some of you already who's using a glass, and you pour your alcohol of choice, whatever it is, you pour it into that glass. And then you put the lid back on the bottle. I know, I've lost the rest of you. You put the lid back on the bottle and you set it down. And you know what this needs? This needs some ice. So I go and I grab some ice and put it in, and I stir the ice. Clink, 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 clink. And I take a little sip and I set it down, and I start talking about the weather or sports or whatever's going on, and the ice begins to melt, and there's a layer of water right around the top of the glass. I mean, who's pissed off right now? You know what I mean? Who is annoyed as heck? Like, Paige, get it in you. We don't drink like that, but we all know when other people drink like that. We got eyes on that. We're like, I'm annoyed for you. Get it in you. But here's the thing, that's how I want to approach the 12 steps. I want to take my time. I want to wade in. The only time in my life I want to take my time, or I want to take it slowly. That's never happened in my life in relationships, with alcohol, with anything. But this time I'm like, let me take it slow. And what happens, the longer that I take, the less I'm going to have that impact. And that's what I found happens. A lot of times people aren't going after the 12 steps the way I went after a drink. And I'm not getting that experience. And so often it is people who have not sought out this experience that are saying, no, you can't have one like that. And I again, the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous, the spiritual experience, it is all experiential. If I wouldn't take advice from drinking from somebody who's sipping their drink, I maybe should use my discernment and taking advice from people that aren't going after it, that haven't sought out these experiences through the 12 steps. It goes on to say, and actually one of the other experiences we're going to talk about in a couple of weeks, when we get to the end of We Agnostics, we're going to talk about Fitzmayo and his spiritual experience. And again, I've had an experience like Fitzmayo's. So the experience that I have is none of my business, but what I got to do is I got to go after it. So it goes on to say, though it was not our intention to create such an impression, many alcoholics have concluded that in order to recover, they must acquire an immediate and overwhelming God consciousness. And remember that word God consciousness or consciousness. Consciousness means with knowing. With knowing. In its original Latin etymology, because I'm really fun. Caroline is like, come to the Christmas party. We'll invite Paige, she'll talk about etymology. I promise that's not going to happen. Alrighty. So it goes on to say, God consciousness, followed at once by a vast change in feeling and outlook. And even though the timeline might vary, that is the element. How I see the world, how I feel, how I show up to life, that is what's going to happen. I'm changed from the inside out. So it says, among our rapidly growing membership of thousands of alcoholics, such transformations, though frequent, are by no means the rule. And that's been my experience. The more that I work with others and we go after this work, the more that I see that is frequent. Not in every case, not all the time, but we have powerful spiritual awakenings if I'm willing to really go after this thing. It goes on to say, and when it says by no means the rule is that's what happens to everyone. That's not to say that that's the case. And again, if I can't stay well on one experience, I need to continue to seek. So if I haven't had one of those, but I continue to seek, I don't know what I'm going to get, but I promise you, I've always gotten what I needed. It goes on to say, many of our experiences are what the psychologist William James calls the educational variety, because they develop slowly over a period of time. And if you are wondering, Paige, what got you to read the book, Varieties of Religious Experiences? So again, for those that are unaware, it's from the early 1900s. It is considered to be quite dry. This is not something you're reading on the beach. It's not a beach book. It is known for being quite dry, which apparently I'm like, that's delightful. Let me just do that casually for fun. Paige, what got you to read something like that? Well, I was in a meeting and somebody mentioned to me, did you know that the phrase educational variety is not found in Varieties of Religious Experience. That's how you get me to do something. You're like, did you know it's not there? I'm like, oh, I gotta find that out. Like make it a little mystery. I'll be Nancy Drew over here. Just trying to figure it out. And so, yeah. And so in the gradual lecture 10 is where I have gradual conversion is referenced. And what's interesting is Varieties of Religious Experiences often it follows a similar format to what we have in the big book. What I mean by that is in the book, I don't know if you've noticed this pattern, but it'll give us information about alcoholism, information about the step, information, and then it will give us a story, because that's how we learn. And it's the same thing in Varieties of Religious Experience. It will give us information in the form of very exciting, just woo. It's not woo. It's not the most riveting. I find it really interesting, but it's not the most riveting stuff. But then what he does is he pulls from stories, and we get to listen to this. I do audiobooks. I get to listen to the stories, and in it, in the gradual conversion, what I was noticing is that gradual conversion was not years. It was usually like a couple weeks at the longest. So again, why I point that out and why I'm so passionate about this is because a lot of times we confuse educational with intellectual. And what I think I need to do is I think I need to figure out a higher power in my mind. I think I need to figure out in my mind the 12 steps. I think I've got to figure this whole thing out, and it has to be in my intellect. But my intellect cannot keep me sober. I know you guys are smarty pantses. I know you are. I can see it. And yet none of my intellect, none of my learning, none of my education outside, it wasn't enough to keep me sober. It wasn't enough to keep me free. But if we look at the education, and what does education mean? In our, it is often rooted in a learning experience. And that gradual conversion is something that happens over time. But again, I just want to encourage us not to be like, oh, it's going to take me several years to get well. Time takes time. That's not my experience. Time takes consistency. A spiritual awakening takes me actually going after this course of action, seeking these 12 steps, going after it. And the idea of education is not intellectual. I'm after an experience, just as I was after the experience of a drink. So it goes on to say, quite often friends of the newcomer are aware of the difference long before he is himself. And that is so true. I can't often see a lot of those more gradual changes within myself. Often other people can see it in me. And, it's been a bit of a tough week, so I've had to make some difficult phone calls and, call some people I haven't spoken to in a while to let them know a couple friends have passed away. And what happens is you start talking, you start kind of catching up with people. And, a friend of mine, a dear friend of mine who was with me, who was through some tough years sober, was like, man, you sound really good. Other stuff aside, you sound really good. And I can't always see the change in me, but other people can see it. And I've shared this before. I have a friend who, God bless, this was a couple of years ago, but she was like, Paige, when I first met you, and when I first met you, that would have been about year 2 of sobriety. She said, you were the most negative and self-deprecating person that I had ever met. So the takeaway is that I win in the negativity and self-deprecation competition. I win. I get the gold star. It's me. But that's not who I am. And that transformation, I had dramatic, quick, rapid experiences and things that took a little bit more time. Both those things are true. But I had to continue to grow and to seek. So it goes on. It says what follows here are the descriptions that Bill Wilson is going to give, the characteristics of what a spiritual experience looks like. So the first one is right here. Number 1. he finally realizes that he has undergone a profound alteration in his reaction to life. So a deep and profound change in how I show up to and react to life. That is the first description that Bill has given us of a spiritual awakening or a spiritual experience, whichever. and so that change, that's the first. Number 2 is right here. That such a change could hardly have been brought about by himself alone. That this was a change that I realized I could not do it. Man, way back when I was that negative, I used to chair a meeting that got a lot of gals from a local women's treatment center. And the treatment center had these rules. And the rules were, if you swore, you had to say affirmations. Now, some of you might have noticed I'm pretty good about my language. My potty mouth is under control. But there was a time where that was less the case. And I will say, we have no affiliation with outside enterprises, so I don't got to follow the treatment center rules. But what would happen is I would say a bad word, and they would then be like, Paige, you have to do affirmations. And I am not being critical of positive affirmations. They can be incredibly helpful for other people. But I couldn't do it. And I would give some of the most sarcastic, unhelpful, I'm grateful that I'm not the biggest piece of garbage. And then I wouldn't use the word garbage and I'd have to do 3 more, compound interest of those affirmations. Rude. And I just could not get there. I could not positively think my way into a new way of thinking. I just could not do it. But what happened is I dove into this course of action. I dove into these 12 steps with a rigor and an energy and really went after it in a way that I didn't before, and I was changed. Also, I'll throw something out. We got no opinion on affirmations, but if you feel like doing affirmations, a more powerful way of doing them is, instead of saying I am or I'm grateful for, is to say thank you God or thank you higher power for whatever it is you're going to say. Turn it into a prayer. So just throwing that out there. Feel free to disregard. So that change that could have hardly been brought about by himself alone, that I couldn't do it. I couldn't bring about that change on my own. It goes on to say, what often takes place in a few months could seldom have been accomplished by years of self-discipline. Again, a few months. And that is the longest description of how long it takes to get well that we see. A few months. It doesn't have to be months. But again, I'm not waiting years to recover. I'm not waiting years to do the steps. I can get well very, very quickly here. So what often takes place in a few months, and that's number 3, could seldom have been accomplished by years of self-discipline. Again, that realization that me trying on my own willpower could not have brought me there. And then this is number 4. With few exceptions, our members find that they have tapped an unsuspected inner resource. And that inner resource is something that we're going to tie into and we're going to talk about as we continue on the chapter, We Agnostics. That inner resource, which they presently identify with their own conception of a capital P power greater than themselves. It is a power within. I get transformed from the inside out. That's what happens. I'm not looking out there. I'm looking in here. And what is revealed is this power. And if please know, if some of the stuff that I'm talking about, you are genuinely like, what? The what? What are you on about? Please know that was my experience. Please know that I remember being at a study and somebody would emphasize within, inside me, in. And I'm like, I remember vividly being like, I know what you're saying in here, but I don't know what you're saying in here, as in my heart. I knew what you were saying intellectually, but I didn't have that experience. And the more I leaned in, the more that experience came. So know that some of these things that I might be like, I don't quite get it. It will click, but it won't click with intellect. It will click with experience. And so those are the descriptions that Bill Wilson is giving of a spiritual experience. Now, you might find it interesting, you might not. So for those that are feeling a little scripturient, I've got some things that you can write down if you'd like. So in Varieties of Religious Experience, on the chapter entitled Mysticism, he gives the 4 qualities that he uses to describe a spiritual experience. And actually, before I do, I'm going to give one quick definition that he gives for describing it in a more general way. You don't have to write it down if you don't want. It says, to be converted, to be regenerated, to receive grace, to experience religion, to gain assurance, are so many phrases which denote the process, gradual or sudden, by which a self hitherto divided and consciously wrong, inferior, and unhappy becomes unified, consciously right, superior, and happy in consequence of its firmer hold of religious realities. And so you can see that, yes, this is a book that's a little dry. And what he's talking about these many ways to be converted, regenerated, receive grace, experience religion, gain assurance. Those are many synonyms for a spiritual awakening. And he talks about the divided self. And the divided self, many of us know, and we're going to talk about that as we continue on in the chapter, we agnostics, when we talk about the bedevilments. But the divided self is that feeling at the core of who I am. I am wrong, I am broken, I am unlovable, I am unworthy, that I am bad, and I cannot overcome it. I feel prey to misery and depression. I feel feeling of uselessness. That divided self, we feel like this broken self. And what happens in this process is we get unified. And the self that once felt broken now feels whole, healthy, okay. And I talk about it like this awakening to the inherent value and worth that I had the whole time, but I couldn't have known it was there. I awakened to that reality, and that's what he's talking about. And he's known for using some fun words. So the 4 qualities that he uses in the chapter on mysticism. The first is, and so you guys are so sick of me using this word, is that it is ineffable. So the first description is that the spiritual awakening is ineffable. And ineffable means to be experienced, to be understood. So you might wonder why in the chapter, we agnostics, there's so many metaphors. It's because how do you explain to somebody the scent of a rose who's never smelt it? How do you explain to somebody that feeling that a new parent has when they hold their newborn in their arms? How do you explain to somebody who's never seen the color green? There's a gal, I'm just thinking, she had this word, the verdancy of things. How do you explain the verdancy, the greenness of green if you've never experienced green? Well, you use metaphor, you use simile, you try to describe around it. And that's what we're saying. The spiritual experience is ineffable, just like that experience that we have all had with that first drink, or that 3-drink glow. It is something to be experienced, to be understood. If you go to a non-alcoholic and you say, do you know what it's like to take that drink and experience that feeling where your soul is soothed and all your problems are answered? They're going to be like, absolutely not. I don't know what you are talking about. No, they don't know, but we know. And it's like that with the spiritual experience. So the first description is that it is ineffable. The second description is that it is noetic. Spelled like with an N, like Noel. Noetic. What that means is that the experience itself reveals divine truths. Truths that we could not otherwise know. And I got some news, that's not the lotto numbers, which, rude, it's not the lotto numbers. I'll tell you some truths that I could not otherwise know, that I don't have to take that first drink. And I'm not talking about knowing it here, and I'm not talking about playing the tape to the end. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the truth where the obsession of the mind is rendered from me. It's taken from me, and I don't have the desire to drink. I'll tell you another truth that I could not otherwise know, that I'm not the biggest piece of garbage, that I am worthy and that I am valuable and I have use to other people, that I am a child of a living God that works in my life. Those divine truths that I could not otherwise know. What about those? But I mean, sometimes it would be nice if God gave me the lotto numbers. Just throwing that out there. So the third is that the experience itself is transient. So the spiritual awakening, it will come and it'll have a limited duration. And that is also, again, why I cannot stay well on one spiritual experience. Just like I couldn't stay well on one drink, I need to keep and to have and to seek a spiritual experience. I need more, just like I needed more alcohol. But the truth is, the more that I do this, the more I root into something deeper. In Varieties of Religious Experience, William James talks about how some of the subjects experienced backsliding. So they experienced, where they were transformed, but some of these old behaviors returned. But very few of them ever changed their mind that there was a power greater than themselves. They were rooted in something different, even though their behavior, they struggled with defects of character, whatever it is. So again, that's why these 12 steps are not a set it and forget it program. It's not I did the steps. It is I'm living these 12 steps as a way of life. And so the fourth, and this might sound weird because I'm saying go after it, but the fourth description that he has of a spiritual experience is passivity. And what that means is I'm not actually able to control its arrival or its departure. I'm not able to just make the spiritual experience come or go. And you might be like, but Paige, you said go after it. You said go after these 12 steps. And yes, that's where two things can be true. I take the actions of the 12 steps and they take me to a place where a spiritual experience happens to me. And this is also a description of something that is ineffable. You kind of got to experience it. I know. I really overuse the word ineffable because it's so good, but it's like I got to experience it. Where it's like I have to have that experience to really understand it. But what I'm saying is I can't force a spiritual experience. But if I take this course of action with everything that I've got, one will happen to me. I'm not doing great for time. Sorry, Papa, you're chairing and I'm already pushing it close. Apparently that is a luxury that is only saved for Neil. I'm selfish and self-centered. But I had an experience where I was having a tough time. It was the 10-year anniversary of getting sick, ending up in a wheelchair. I had somebody that was just awful to me and like shaming, and I was having this really hard time. And I go out to the mountains, and if you guys don't know, I live just less than an hour away from the Rocky Mountains and some of the most beautiful places on earth. And I was sitting out there and I was just watching the mountains, and I was still in my head and wrapped up with what a piece of garbage I am and I suck and like the trauma and the shame and all that. And I said a prayer, and I said it out loud. I don't typically pray out loud unless I'm like, praying out loud with sponsees and stuff. And it was like this prayer of like, I just need to know that you love me. Because I felt so empty and so alone and so worthless. And I didn't get that answer in that moment. I didn't. But I remembered an experience that of a gentleman that I now have the privilege of sponsoring, where he spoke about you can't force a spiritual experience. I'm like, right, that's it. And as I went back to the campsite, I had this powerful experience of that power and a powerful message of God's love for me in my life. And I won't go too much into detail because I'm already on a tangent, on my tangent, on a tangent, and I'm going to tangent some more. So those are the four descriptions of a spiritual experience that is given to us by William James. And those are in the chapter called Mysticism. And sometimes we don't really understand what mysticism means. It kind of gets a bad rap. I think we often describe it as a little woo-woo, a little like, and I'm not going to use descriptions, but that person where you're like, yikes, I don't want to let you pet sit my tortoise because I'm worried what's going to happen. That's a joke for Corinna. Like they're a little out there, Corinna's like, I don't know about you, and so, but no. Mysticism is really, the definition of it, is about experiencing the capital R real. That's what mysticism is. To have a spiritual experience. And a contemporary of William James. William James, he wasn't somebody who had a spiritual experience himself. He was interested in it. And actually, he had a brother, I believe it is a brother, who wrote a book, The Turn of the Screw, which is a gothic horror. So there were people that were in his family that were interested in some of this stuff. But a contemporary of his, somebody who was alive and active at the same time, was a woman by the name of Evelyn Underhill. And she had her own descriptions of a spiritual experience as somebody who experienced spiritual awakenings. And part of why I love William James, and deeper than that, Evelyn Underhill, she's my gal. You don't have to be interested in these people, but they were talking about people who engaged in meditative practices forever. And I had heard for a long time, there was no meditation in the 1930s. It didn't exist. It only meant thinking. But if it didn't exist, how come William James is able to talk about people who had meditative practices? How come Evelyn Underhill is able to talk about people who had meditative practices? And it just clicked some things that I knew in my heart to be true, but I didn't have the words or the understanding to explain. And Evelyn Underhill, she talks about mysticism is unity or union with the capital R real. And what is real is that ability to, that's so cool. She's got a book, Mysticism. That's a huge undertaking. Practical Mysticism is another of her books. It's a little bit more accessible if anyone's interested in reading it. She also loved cats, for the cat lovers. Just throwing that out. A lot of these people did. And so she was just so interesting. And again, this study of spiritual awakening, it's been going on forever. So it says, most of us think this awareness of a capital P power greater than ourselves is the essence of spiritual experience, this connectedness, this knowing. Our more religious members call it God consciousness, that with knowing experience that we have, especially in step 11. Most emphatically, which is to say with emphasis, we wish to say that any alcoholic, and this is one of the hills that I die upon. I'm not pedantic about whether you call it a spiritual experience, spiritual awakening for this or that. I'm not pedantic about what you call your evening review. But one of the places I am pedantic, a hill that I will die on, is that you can recover, is that you can have a spiritual awakening. This is available to each and every one of us. And if there was somebody who used to suck the energy out of the room, that was miserable beyond measure, it was me. And if I can be transformed, man, there's nothing special about this little drunk. There's not. I just did the stuff and really did the stuff. So it says, most emphatically, we wish to say that any alcoholic, which is you, capable of honestly facing his problems. How do we do that? We do that in the 12 steps. That's how we face them. And the light of our experience can recover, provided he does not close his mind to all spiritual concepts. I just need to be open. Faith is not certainty. Faith is simply an open hand, reaching for a new experience. That is what faith is. And it says he can only be defeated. So the only thing that can defeat me is an attitude. Didn't know that was important. I can only be defeated by an attitude of intolerance or belligerent denial. So not being open, being like, no, and this is what it looks like. No, I know that your steps couldn't help me. No, Paige, I know inventory couldn't help. Yeah, no, I know I don't need to make an amends there. I know they're not interested in hearing about my amends. No, I know I couldn't help other people. I know that the results of the actions that I'm not taking wouldn't work. You know what I'm saying? That is what it looks like. I know prayer couldn't work. I know I can't meditate. I can't tell you how often. That is the most common old idea that I hear. I can't meditate. You know why? It's we all say, because my mind wanders. Guess what? The brain is an organ. Its job is to think. Everybody's mind wanders. Dalai Lama, probably a pretty good meditator. I'll throw it out there. Guess what? His mind, guess what it does in meditation? Wanders. That's everyone. You're not alone. I ruined your day. I'm sorry. Alrighty. So it goes on to say, he can only be defeated by an attitude of intolerance or belligerent denial. We find that no one And so no one is not you. Or like, do you know what I mean? You're not going to have problems with, no, you can recover. That's what I'm trying to get at. No one need have difficulty with the spirituality of this program. Willingness, honesty, and open-mindedness are the essentials of recovery, but these are indispensable. And if you remember Bill's story, he talks about that willingness, honesty, humility to establish and maintain the new order of things were the essential requirements. So that I need to be open, willing, humble, honest, and I need to continue. I need to have that spiritual awakening, but I need to grow it and to seek and to deepen. It says these are indispensable. We can't go without them. It goes on to say, there is a principle which is bar against all information, which is proof against all argument, and which cannot fail to keep a man in everlasting ignorance. That principle is contempt prior to investigation. And what that means is that there is nothing that will keep us stuck. Nothing that will keep us stuck where we are, rather stronger than I know. I know this won't work for me. This unwillingness to try, this unwillingness to seek. It shuts down every argument there is. I know it couldn't help. And then it says Herbert Spencer. And the quote is actually not a Herbert Spencer quote, which is actually good news because Herbert Spencer wasn't a great guy. It should be attributed to William Paley, who was an English clergyman, author, and lecturer. And Rob's got some info about him in the chat. And you might be like, hey, why did they get this wrong? Well, I'll tell you why they got it wrong. The quote was originally in a story that was called An Artist's Concept. And the author of that story was Ray Campbell. And he was the gentleman that designed the first edition dust cover, that red and yellow dust cover. He also designed, and I'm a fan of Art Deco, I really like that art style. He designed an Art Deco version of the Big Book cover. And so he was the artist that did that. And he had that misquote in his story. But when his story was taken out, they thought they would keep the quote because it was a good quote. So that mistake carried on. And with that, that's me giving Peppa absolutely no time to wrap up. So I'll leave it there. And next week we'll continue on in We Agnostics. Thank you so much.